Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you will learn how to run multiple Kubernetes clusters locally on your machine. And these Kubernetes clusters can be of a single node or even multiple nodes. This lecture is going to be quite interesting, so make sure you watch it till the end. There are two primary reasons why I'm making this video today. Number one is to help beginners. A lot of beginners, even today, when they start learning Kubernetes or practicing Kubernetes, they try to install Kubernetes cluster locally using Minikube. It's quite understandable why people try Minikube. One, it is one of the first Kubernetes local distributions. It is part of Kubernetes official documentation. So people who initially tried Kubernetes 6 years back, 5 years back, so they tried with Minikube and the legacy just continued. So when beginners search for blogs, videos, very popular thing that they find is run Kubernetes cluster locally using Minikube. And most of those videos are around using HyperKit as Minikube driver or using VirtualBox as Minikube driver. In both of these cases, what Minikube does, it spins up a virtual machine on your laptop. Let's say you're using Oracle VirtualBox as a driver. That is Minikube start -- driver VirtualBox. When you pass this command, so what Minikube does, it spins up a virtual machine by using VirtualBox, and within this virtual machine, it tries to install Kubernetes cluster. So this is called all-in-one Kubernetes cluster, because both your control plane or your data plane, that is your master worker nodes, everything is in one single virtual machine. So the problem with this approach is that, and a lot of beginners face this problem. So this virtual machine or this approach requires 2 CPU and 4 GB RAM at the least on your local machine. Let's say you're running some other processes. Maybe you're running Docker, or maybe you're running Olama or anything else. If these requirements are not met, then the virtual machine does not spin up. It abruptly kills the process, or even you face a lot of issues at the start of the Minikube cluster. Because of these reasons, what a lot of beginners do, they go to EC2 instance or cloud virtual machines. I've seen a lot of people using T2 medium EC2 instance just to spin up Minikube on that instance, and this does not come for free, so they end up spending a lot of money on the cloud bills. Or people go for managed Kubernetes services like EKS, AKS, etc. In this video, we will address this problem, and I'm going to show you how you can efficiently run Kubernetes clusters without this requirement or without even spinning up virtual machines. And the second problem is that some people actually use Docker driver with Minikube, which is quite good, right? When you use Docker driver with Minikube, that is just by using Minikube start -- driver is equals to Docker, or Docker as driver. So this is actually good, because in this case, what Minikube does is, instead of spinning a virtual machine, it spins up a container. While this is good, there are problems with this approach. That is, it's perfectly fine if you need one Kubernetes cluster, but when you need multiple Kubernetes clusters, I'll also share the use cases. Why would you need multiple Kubernetes clusters in a while? But when you need multiple Kubernetes clusters, and if all of these Kubernetes clusters have to parallelly run, then the profiles in Minikube, right? Where when you try to create multiple profiles in Minikube to run multiple Kubernetes clusters, it does not work that efficiently. So either this is your problem or this is your problem, where you are not able to run Minikube locally using HyperKit or VirtualBox, or you're using Minikube Docker driver, but you run into issues running multi-node Kubernetes cluster, or maybe you want to run multiple Kubernetes clusters parallelly. You will get the answer in this video. So what we are going to do is we are going to use KIND, which is called Kubernetes in Docker. So what we are going to do is we are actually going to run Kubernetes clusters using Docker containers, or using the concept of containers. So in this approach, what we actually do is that, let's say you want to spin up a single node Kubernetes cluster. So what kind does, it creates a single Docker container, and within this Docker container, it installs the Kubernetes cluster. Let's say you want to run a multi-node Kubernetes cluster. That is, maybe you need one master and two worker nodes. In that case, what kind does, it creates one, two, three Docker containers, where in one of the Docker container, it installs the Kubernetes control plane, and in rest of the Docker containers, it installs the Kubernetes data plane. And kind takes the responsibility of connecting the worker nodes to the Kubernetes control plane. So this is how, what kind does, instead of creating your Kubernetes cluster using virtual machines, it actually creates your Kubernetes cluster using containers, right? When you're using EKS or AKS, you're actually doing the same thing, but in EKS or AKS, you were using virtual machines. Control plane is in a virtual machine, worker node is in a different virtual machine, so on. But kind just replace that entire thing using containers. Now, because of this, kind is extremely lightweight, and it also addresses the challenge of using Minikube with Docker driver. They're almost the same if you're using Minikube with Docker driver or kind, but because kind is designed keeping containers in mind, it does not run into problem when you run multiple Kubernetes clusters on your local machine, or when you want to run a single Kubernetes cluster with multiple nodes as well. We are going to see that in the practical section, right? Now the question is, Abhishek, why do you actually need multiple Kubernetes clusters? Like, as a DevOps engineer, what will be my use case? This is a very valid question. Let me start explaining multiple scenarios. The first scenario, as a DevOps engineer, let's say you're working with multiple clients. So your clients are basically your development teams, where you're working with a development team called products, and you're working with another development team called as catalog, another development team called as shipping. Now, if you create for even simple use cases, or when you want to quickly try out things locally, it's not a good practice that you always spin up EKS clusters, AKS clusters, because it is going to cost a lot for your organization. So what you can do is you can keep a Kubernetes cluster, that is a kind Kubernetes cluster for products team, another kind Kubernetes cluster for XYZ team, another kind Kubernetes cluster for this team. And whenever you don't need this, you can just run a simple command and this cluster is tear down. Even if you are a developer, let's say you are a developer and you are working with multiple customers, right? You have customer XYZ and you have, let's say, customer called Nike, and you have another customer, let's say, called Amazon. Now, Amazon reports the issue that your application is not working fine. And Nike reports that your application is working fine for the requirement Amazon stated, but we are running into a different issue. Even in such cases, as developer, you can have multiple Kubernetes clusters running locally. So similarly, there are other use cases like, let's say you are doing a proof of concept of Argo CD, where the proof of concept that is given to you is multi Kubernetes cluster deployment, right? You are working on this experiment where whenever there is a change in the application, once your CI/CD cluster or pipeline is triggered, as part of your CD stage, instead of deploying to one Kubernetes cluster, you want to deploy to multiple Kubernetes clusters, right? Before you try this on your dev, staging, or production, if you have a local Kubernetes cluster, you can try this out. Similarly, the possibilities are endless. You will, as a DevOps engineer or a developer, need multiple Kubernetes clusters and sometime one Kubernetes cluster with 10 nodes. You are testing HPA or you are testing VPA, or let's say you want to test the Kubernetes toleration, taint, you want to test the Kubernetes node scheduling. For any of these reasons, this particular video is going to serve as a use case. Now, having talked all of these things, let's see how to use kind. So as I told you, kind is nothing but Kubernetes in Docker, where you are running Kubernetes cluster within the Docker containers. Because of that, the requirement or the prerequisite for this is you need to have Docker desktop up and running. So I would recommend Docker desktop only. Let's say you're on Windows or you're on Mac, go for Docker desktop. Even if you have a Linux based machine, go for Docker desktop. But typically, if you have a Linux based machine, this works natively. Even if you have Docker CLI, that's fine, right? So how do you do this? Once you have Docker running, just verify Docker PS, perfect. So Docker is running fine. Now what you will do is just go for kind documentation. So this is a kind documentation and look for installation. So the installation is very simple. If you're on Linux, run this command. If you're on macOS, run this command. Or if you're on Windows, go to PowerShell and run this command. So I was on macOS, so I actually executed this command and I can verify by running kind --version or kind version. Perfect. So I have kind up and running. Now, all that you need to do, if you want to create a single node Kubernetes cluster, see how I'm going to create kind create cluster --name is equals to single node demo. Okay, I'll provide that name. And within less than a minute, you will have a Kubernetes cluster that is up and running. Perfect, that's all. So you have a Kubernetes cluster running. We can see that if I just do kind get clusters, see single node demo cluster is running. Even if I do kubectl config current context, you will see kubectl is connected to this particular single node demo cluster. We can also verify by running kubectl create deployment nginx hyphen image nginx. So it said deployment is created, kubectl get pods hyphen w. See, the container is creating, and within next 10 to 15 seconds, you will see that nginx is running on this particular kind cluster. For the very first time, it takes little amount of time, but after that, you will see the pod running efficiently. That's all. We have nginx up and running here on this single node kind cluster. Now, how do we create multi-node kind cluster or a Kubernetes cluster? For that, instead of using the command line, what we need to do, I mean, you can do it through command line as well, but how you can do better is just go to kind documentation, click on the configuration button, and within the configuration, you have a lot of examples. One of the examples, right? So just create a file here, vim multi-node k8s cluster.yaml. So this is the API kind cluster, and this is the API version. Then you just have to provide the node details. Let's say you want one control plane node and 3 worker nodes. This is how you define. Now I need 3 control plane nodes and 6 worker nodes. Let's see if I'm able to do it. And let's see how much time it is going to take. So I'll just copy this and I'll just mention this. Okay. So 3 control plane nodes and 6 worker nodes. So overall, I'm going to create a Kubernetes cluster with 9 nodes. Let's try that. Kind create cluster hyphen name 9 node cluster. Just I'm giving that as the name. And I just need to pass hyphen config is equals to multi-node k8s cluster.yaml. Now let's see how much time it is going to take to create a 9 node Kubernetes cluster. So it said ensuring the node image, preparing the nodes, writing the configuration. Okay. So it is starting the control plane. From the last time, it is taking little more time here because 3 control plane nodes. Okay, it said joining more control plane nodes. Perfect. Joining worker nodes and our cluster is ready. I think it took 30 seconds, not more than that. If I do kubectl config current context, it said 9 node cluster. Cool. Now what I'm going to do is kubectl get nodes to verify if I actually have a 9 node Kubernetes cluster. Perfect. I have a 9 node Kubernetes cluster and I was able to spin this up in just 30 seconds. Now, because I spin this up, it will not delete my previous cluster. If I do kind get clusters, I can see along with the single node demo cluster that I created 5 minutes back, I also have this 9 node cluster. Similarly, I can create 10, 15 Kubernetes clusters as well. Of course, depending upon your laptop spec. But at the most, you can create multiple single node Kubernetes clusters because end of the day, what you are running are just Docker containers. We can also check that if we do Docker PS pipe grep-i single node demo, you will find that it created a single node it created a single Docker container. In the same way, if I run a 9-node Kubernetes cluster. Docker ps grep-i 9-node cluster. I will find 9 containers that are running. Along with that, there is additional container because we are creating multi-node Kubernetes cluster. It also created external load balancer. But otherwise, it created this 9 Docker containers. Now, Abhishek, this is very cool, but I want to run the applications and I want to expose the application. If I am using EKS or if I'm using AKS, I can actually do it because it supports load balancer service type, right? It supports ingress, ingress controller. Even if I don't install ingress and ingress controller, I can just do it with the load balancer service type, right? But when you are doing this locally, it's not possible. Thing is, there is a project called Meta LP, but still, if you want to do it natively without installing anything, what you can do is you can simply run kubectl port forward. Let's say you are working on a 3-tier architecture application, and once the application is up, you want to see the user interface of the application. So to get a feel of it, you are using EKS or AKS cluster. You can also do it with kind Kubernetes cluster by running kubectl port forward. Let's see how. In our case, we will continue use that Nginx deployment itself. Kubectl create deployment Nginx -- image is equals to Nginx. Okay, now I installed Nginx on this 9-node Kubernetes cluster. kubectl get pods. Especially if you are learning Kubernetes, this local Kubernetes clusters are going to help you a lot, because if you want to practice pod affinity, or let's say you want to practice node affinity, node level selector, you want to practice taints, tolerations, or pod disruption budget, or scaling of Kubernetes. In all of these concepts, having a local Kubernetes cluster is going to greatly help you. Okay, now the Nginx container is running. What we will do is kubectl port forward pod slash name of the pod, followed by, let's give a random port. I'll call it 8888 colon 80. So 80 is the Nginx port. I know Nginx by default runs on port 80. So I'm mapping local port 8088 to 80 on my machine. Now let's go to the browser and let's search for localhost colon 8088. Okay, there is a typo. Let's do localhost 8888. See, it said welcome to Nginx. Perfect. So this is how you can use the local Kubernetes cluster and even expose the interface, that is the user interface. Abhishek, in which use cases I cannot use these local Kubernetes clusters? So let's say you are using use cases such as Kubernetes cluster upgrades, right? You want to test out the Kubernetes cluster upgrades, or maybe you want to play with high-level Kubernetes concepts like admission controller or developing your own controller, operators. In such cases, the local Kubernetes clusters might not be that helpful, but in majority of the cases, you don't need to go to an EC2 instance, that is a virtual machine, and install Minikube, or you don't have to go for EKS, AKS clusters and spend a lot of money. These local clusters are going to help you in majority of your tasks. So after all this, I would recommend to go to the official kind documentation, right? So this is the kind documentation, and try to spend some time because they have a lot of examples. After watching this video, if you do a quick glance, you will learn more about kind and how exactly it works. And also, if you have WSL, let's say you're using Windows 10 or Windows 11, so you can run kind on your Windows subsystem for Linux, right? Using WSL2. First of all, try with Docker Desktop. Even if you have a Windows machine, just run Docker Desktop on your Windows, and within that Windows machine, try to install and run kind. If it does not work, you can go for WSL2. Otherwise, it might even work with Docker Desktop alone. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you found it informative. If you have any questions on this topic, do let me know. I am more than happy to help you. See you all. Take care. Bye bye.